It began with something so small that most archaeologists would have dismissed it instantly. A piece of lead no larger than a postage stamp, folded tight like a clenched hand. It came from a pile of debris, the kind most excavation teams toss aside without a second look. Yet inside that forgotten fragment lay a message sealed for more than 3,000 years. A message that would ignite one of the most intense debates in modern biblical archaeology. The discovery took place on Mount Ebal, a barren rise north of ancient Shechem, long associated with curses, covenants, and the earliest rituals of Israel. For decades, archaeologists walked its slopes knowing the biblical story. Moses commanded an altar to be built there, and Joshua was said to have carried it out, an altar of uncut stones where Israel renewed its covenant through blessings and curses. Scholars debated whether it ever existed, whether Israel was even literate at the time, or whether the narrative was a later invention. The mountain was steeped in tradition but starved of evidence. Then came the 2019 wet sifting project, a method borrowed from Temple Mount debris analysis. Workers re-examined material originally overlooked in earlier excavations. And there, in the sifted rubble, they found the tiny, tightly folded lead tablet. It was impossibly dense, impossible to open physically without destroying whatever text might remain inside. But its location embedded within debris taken from a structure some believed to be Joshua's altar instantly raised the stakes. At first glance, the tablet appeared blank. No visible markings, no engravings, no decipherable lines. Just a dull gray square of ancient metal. Many expected nothing to come of it. Yet the team knew that lid tablets, especially folded ones, were often used in the ancient world as curse tablets, objects sealed with maledictions intended to invoke divine power. Their secrecy was intentional, their inscriptions hidden, their discovery always controversial. To access what might be concealed inside, researchers turned to advanced micro-CT scanning, the same technology used to read carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum. Layer by layer, slice by slice, the machine revealed what the eye could not. Faint scratches forming letters older than classical Hebrew, older than Phoenician, written in a primitive proto-alphabetic script. And among those letters, repeated again and again, appeared something astonishing, the earliest known form of the divine name, YHW. The reaction among the researchers was immediate and electrifying. If authentic, the tablet did not just contain a curse. It contained the name of Israel's God in a script dating to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, precisely the period associated with Joshua's conquest. In a single moment, the tablet challenged three pillars of mainstream academic belief: that Israel was illiterate at the time, that the conquest narratives were written centuries later, and that the altar on Mount Ebal had no historical foundation. Yet for all its explosive potential, the find remained curiously muted in the broader world. Press coverage was minimal. Academic institutions hesitated, and political tensions surrounding the site located in a deeply contested region cast long shadows over its interpretation. Still, the evidence was there, a cursed tablet, sealed for millennia, discovered exactly where the biblical text said curses were once declared. The implications were enormous, but to understand why this tiny artifact matters, we must first understand the mountain itself, why it was chosen, what the ancient text says about it, and how its role in Israel's early history sets the stage for everything that follows. Long before scholars debated timelines, inscriptions, or the origins of early Israel, Mount Ebal carried a reputation older than archaeology itself, a reputation carved into the very narrative of Deuteronomy. It is the mountain of curses, the dark twin of Mount Gerizim's blessings. When Moses stood before the Israelites on the plains of Moab, he described a future ceremony unlike anything else in the ancient Near East. Half the tribes would ascend Mount Gerizim to proclaim blessings, while the other half would stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses. And on Ebal alone God commanded, an altar must be built. Not an altar of cut stones, not shaped by tools or decorated like Canaanite shrines. The stones must remain natural, untouched by iron, an unmistakable marker of Israelite identity. There sacrifices would be offered. There the law would be declared. There, the covenant would be renewed with solemnity and fear. In the biblical imagination, Mount Ebal was not a place of celebration. It was a place of consequence. This context matters because Mount Ebal is not an obvious sacred site. It is barren, rocky, and visually unremarkable. Its slopes offer no strategic advantage, no architectural beauty, and no natural resources. It is the last place a civilization would choose to build a grand religious monument unless commanded to do so. And that very strangeness gave the mountain its significance. Ebal was chosen precisely because it was a place no one else wanted, a symbol of humility, obedience, and the cost of covenant loyalty. For centuries, scholars wondered whether anything ever happened there at all. Was the ceremony described in Deuteronomy a historical event or a literary device? Did Joshua really build an altar on that mountain? Did early Israel gather there to recite blessings and curses? Or were these stories crafted much later, designed to give Israel's laws a dramatic backdrop? Then came the excavations. In the 1980s, archaeologist Adam Zertel surveyed the region and found a curious structure on Mount Ebal's northern slope. It was unlike typical Canaanite sanctuaries. It lacked idols, carvings, and cultic iconography. Instead, it was a rectangular, elevated installation made of uncut stones, exactly what Deuteronomy describes. Beneath it, charter-like layers of ash, bones, and pottery fragments suggested a structured ritual site. Zertel proposed that this could be Joshua's altar, the very one commanded in Scripture. The academic world recoiled. The implications were too great. Zertel's interpretation was controversial, bold, unsettling, but he stood by it. What made his claim even more striking was the site's isolation. No settlement, no major city, no temple complex nearby. Just a lonely mountaintop, exactly where Deuteronomy said the altar should be. Still, the debate dragged on for decades. Some dismissed the structure as a watchtower, others as a cultic platform. Yet no alternative interpretation fully accounted for its unique features. And then, decades after Zertel's excavation, something unimaginable happened. During a reanalysis of the discarded soil from that very site, a process never performed during the original digs, workers found the small, folded lead tablet. It came not from a random hillside, not from a nearby settlement, but directly from the debris associated with the stone structure Zertel had identified. The convergence is too precise to ignore, a mountain mentioned exclusively as the site of curses. An altar made of uncut stones, a structure fitting biblical ritual requirements. And now, a cursed tablet sealed, hidden, waiting emerging from the rubble of that same altar. To understand what the altar truly was and why this tablet matters so profoundly, we must now look at the structure itself. Its layers links it directly to one of the oldest and events in biblical history. When archaeologist Adam Zertel first climbed the rugged slopes of Mount Ebal in the early 1980s, he expected little more than another survey point, one more dot on the archaeological map of the Central Highlands. Instead, he found a structure that would dominate his career, divide his colleagues, and eventually set the stage for the discovery of the cursed tablet. What he uncovered was a large installation unlike any other known in the region, a massive, elevated, rectangular structure built of uncut stones. Within it lay a smaller, older altar sealed inside a larger one, both layered with ash, bones, and pottery consistent with early Israelite occupation. At first glance, the site seemed oddly plain: no walls, no pillars, no monumental inscriptions, yet its simplicity was precisely what made it suspicious. The Book of Deuteronomy had commanded that an altar be built on Mount Ebal using stones not shaped by iron tools. Zertel's structure matched that requirement exactly. Its stones were untouched by chisels, stacked according to a coherent architectural plan, forming an elevated ramp suitable for the kind of sacrificial rituals described in the biblical text. Even its orientation aligned with the valley where, according to the narrative, Israel would have declared curses toward the mountain. While excavating the larger structure, Zertel encountered something even more intriguing: an earlier, smaller altar buried beneath it. As if a first installation had been intentionally preserved inside a later, expanded version. This inner altar contained a concentration of burnt animal bones, primarily from kosher species, suggesting controlled sacrificial activity rather than random settlement debris. Combined with the isolated location atop Mount Ebal, the evidence hinted at a ritual site, not a domestic or defensive structure. But not everyone agreed with Zertel's conclusions. Some critics argued the structure could have been a watchtower foundation or an agricultural installation. Others insisted it was too unusual to fit typical Israelite patterns. Yet those criticisms often avoided addressing the most striking fact: the structure's form fit the biblical description far better than any alternative explanation. Its stones were uncut. Its layout resembled an altar. Its ramp configuration mirrored ancient sacrificial platforms. And its location matched the command given to Joshua: build an altar on Mount Ebal. Despite this, the site became a battleground of academic discomfort. Many scholars preferred to avoid associating archaeological finds with biblical events, especially events as early as the conquest narratives. Linking the structure to Joshua would require reconsidering long-established theories about Israel's origins. It would challenge assumptions about literacy, settlement patterns, and historical memory. And for some, it simply felt safer to classify the altar as an anomaly with no clear interpretation. Yet the evidence continued to speak. Animal bones from the site were dated to the Late Bronze and Early Iron Ages, the exact transitional period in which Israel is believed to have emerged. Pottery fragments fit early Israelite typologies rather than Canaanite luxury goods. The altar was placed deliberately on a natural outcrop, raised above its surroundings, matching ancient descriptions of covenant rituals. Nothing about the site suggested domestic life. Everything suggested intentional worship. And then there was the most important clue of all, the debris. When Zertel's team removed fill material from the layers surrounding the altars, they cataloged thousands of small fragments, bones, stones, pottery, and soil. These were stored for decades, rarely revisited until a wet sifting project re-examined them many years later. It was in that old debris forgotten, unremarkable, nearly discarded that the folded lid tablet appeared. The tablet's presence makes sense only within a ritual context. A curse tablet is out of place in a farmhouse, a watchtower, or an agricultural installation. But in a covenant altar on the Mountain of Curses, it fits perfectly. And because the tablet likely came from the inner layers of the earlier altar, its date could correspond to the earliest phases of Israelite worship at the site. Thus, Zertel's discovery, dismissed by many during his lifetime, became the context necessary to understand one of the most important archaeological finds of the modern era. And to see why this tiny piece of lead carries so much weight, we must now turn to the object itself, the sealed tablet that held its secrets for over 3 millennia. The folded lead tablet from Mount Ebal was so small, so unremarkable, that at first glance it seemed almost insignificant. Barely 2 centimeters across, it looked more like a fragment of scrap metal than an artifact capable of reshaping the historical debate around Israel's earliest presence in the land. Yet its discovery within debris taken directly from the altar's structure raised immediate and unsettling questions. How did such an object end up there? Who placed it? And most importantly, what message had it carried in silence for more than 3 millennia? The altar itself had already been the center of fierce controversy. Adam Zertel, the archaeologist who excavated the site beginning in the 1980s, had argued that the structure built entirely of uncut stones and showing signs of ritual animal sacrifice fit the biblical description of the altar Joshua constructed on Mount Ebal, but mainstream academia resisted the idea. Zertel's find threatened prevailing theories about early Israelite history, literacy, and settlement patterns. So the altar remained in a state of academic limbo, intriguing but disputed, promising but inconvenient. Then the tablet emerged from the rubble. It had been overlooked for decades, buried among stones and soil removed in the original excavation. Only when wet sifting techniques were applied, techniques capable of catching objects too small for traditional archaeological methods, did the tablet surface. Its folded shape was the first clue. Throughout the ancient Near East, curse tablets were known to be deliberately sealed, their inscriptions hidden to protect the potency of the message inside. They were not meant to be read by human eyes, but to be delivered to the divine realm. Their secrecy was central to their function, but lead tablets cannot simply be unfolded. Lead becomes brittle with age, and opening the tablet physically would have destroyed any inscription inside. The team needed a way to see through metal without touching it. That is where micro-CT scanning, normally used in industrial engineering and medical imaging, became indispensable. It allowed researchers to generate digital slices of the tablet, peeling back layers of metal through 3-dimensional imaging. What they saw was astonishing. The interior was etched with markings, lines, scratches, and symbols that gradually emerged as a coherent script. But this was not classical Hebrew. It was older. Much older. Proto-alphabetic markings, the earliest stage of the alphabetic system, were visible along the tablet's internal surface. This script had parallels in inscriptions found in the Sinai and in early Canaanite contexts. Inscriptions dating to a time when scholars had insisted Israel was largely illiterate. And then came the most explosive element, the divine name. Not in its later Hebrew form, but in a primitive configuration Y/H repeated multiple times within a curse formula. The message hidden inside the tablet was intense, almost chilling in its solemnity. It declared curses against anyone who violated the covenant, precisely the kind of ritual language described in Deuteronomy and Joshua. And it appeared in a place where the biblical text explicitly commanded curses to be spoken. It was as if the object had been waiting for technology to catch up. The implications were staggering. The tablet not only confirmed literacy at an unexpectedly early stage, but also connected directly to the covenant ceremony described in the Bible. It suggested that the people associated with Joshua as conquest were not mere tribes without written tradition. They were literate, ritualistic, and deeply aware of covenantal language. Yet despite the magnitude of this discovery, academic reaction remained cautious, even resistant. The political sensitivity of the site, combined with the disruptive nature of the findings, ensured that the tablet became more whispered about than broadcasted. To understand why such a monumental artifact, we must now examine the inscription itself, how it was written, and why its message is unlike anything previously discovered in biblical archaeology. What the micro-CT scans revealed inside the folded lid tablet stunned even the researchers who had suspected there might be something significant hidden within. After thousands of cross-sectional images were compiled into a digital reconstruction, the interior of the tablet slowly emerged layer by layer, line by faint line. At first, the scratches looked random, almost accidental. But patterns began to form, angles repeated, strokes aligned. And then, unmistakably, letters appeared. Not Hebrew as we know it, not Phoenician, not Aramaic, something older, something primitive, something from the very dawn of alphabetic writing. The inscription used proto-alphabetic characters, the earliest stage of the alphabet system that would later evolve into Phoenician, and ultimately, the Hebrew script familiar today. This alone was extraordinary. Very few inscriptions from this period survive, and even fewer come from the Central Highlands associated with early Israel. But the true shock came when scholars identified the sequence YHW, a three-letter form of the divine name. An archaic precursor to YHWH, it appeared not once, but multiple times woven into a curse formula characteristic of ancient Near Eastern depictions. The repeated invocations suggested intentional emphasis, reinforcing the gravity of the malediction sealed inside the lead. The reconstructed text, as translated by epigraphers, read in essence, cursed, 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 cursed by the god YHW. You will die cursed because you have cursed yourself. A terrifyingly blunt formula. Simple, direct, legally binding, and unmistakably tied to covenant language. For biblical scholars, this raised immediate and uncomfortable questions. If this tablet truly dates to the Late Bronze Age or Early Iron Age, then it means the Israelites, or a group using the same divine name, were literate centuries earlier than mainstream academic timelines allow. Traditional scholarship has long argued that early Israel did not develop writing until much later, and that the biblical narratives of Moses and Joshua were recorded generations after the events they describe. But a proto-alphabetic curse invoking YHW at Mount Ebal, the very mountain where Deuteronomy commands Israel to declare curses, forces a re-evaluation. It suggests that the covenantal traditions were not late inventions but early memories. That Israel's oldest religious expressions were already inscribed, not merely spoken. And that the name of Israel as God was invoked in written form long before classical Hebrew emerged. Archaeologically, the tablet bridges two worlds. The ritual described in the biblical text remains of a cultic structure on the If the altar discovered by altar of Joshua, then the tablet within its debris is not only logically corrected. Deuteronomy 20 commands the proclamation of curses. Tablets like this were part of covenant rituals throughout their placement within altars or their even the handwriting style. Proto-alphabetic script was used in the and by early Semitic populations during the period of emergence. The strokes inside the own examples carved on rocks, pottery, from the same cultural horizon. It's out of place with one exception: its clarity. It arrives so completely sealed. And that is precisely why the tablet is so revolutionary. It is a pristine time capsule. A message intentionally hidden, preserved by lid, protected from erosion, sealed away from decay. It carries a theological, cultural, and linguistic fingerprint from the earliest chapters of Israel's story. Now, with the inscription understood, we must consider its implications, how this tiny artifact rewrites the scholarly timeline, reshapes debates about early Israel, and challenges long-held assumptions about literacy, religion, and history. The moment the inscription inside the Mount Ebal tablet became legible, every assumption about early Israel shifted. For decades, scholars argued that the Israelites of Joshua's era were illiterate nomads who left no written trace of their existence. Writing, they said, emerged in Israel centuries later during the monarchy, perhaps even in the time of David. Yet here, folded inside a tiny lid tablet found exactly where Joshua was said to have built an altar, was a written curse invoking the name YHW in a script older than classical Hebrew. It was not merely an inscription. It was a declaration that the early Israelites could write, did write, and wrote using a system far more ancient than anyone expected. And that revelation sends shockwaves through archaeology. First, the chronology of the conquest comes under pressure. If the tablet truly dates to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, it places literate Israelites in Canaan precisely when the biblical narrative claims they entered. This undermines the dominant academic view that the conquest stories were invented centuries after the events they describe. A literate population is capable of preserving detailed historical memory. A literate population does not need later scribes to fabricate its origins. Second, the tablet challenges long-held theories about Jericho. If early Israel possessed writing and ritual curses at Mount Ebal, the very mountain associated with covenant renewal, then the dramatic fall of Jericho described in Joshua is no longer easily dismissed as myth. The altar and the tablet together form a contextual chain linking Israel's earliest movements in the land. They root the biblical account in a landscape that fits the story more closely than critics ever acknowledged. Third, the structure of the inscription itself is revealing. The tablet contains a stylized chiastic pattern, a symmetrical literary form used throughout biblical Hebrew: curse dash curse dash curse dash name dash name dash curse dash curse dash curse. This structure suggests a ritual composition rather than a personal message. In other words, the tablet is not random, it's liturgical. It mirrors the ceremony described in Deuteronomy 27, where curses are pronounced from Mount Ebal. The altar and the inscription reinforce one another like puzzle pieces from the same box. Fourth, the fact that the tablet is a defixio, a curse tablet, is significant. Curses in the ancient Near East served legal, territorial, and covenantal functions. They marked boundaries, invoked divine witnesses, and sealed agreements. This tablet, buried within the altar's debris, is exactly the kind of object one would expect in a covenant renewal site. Its presence is not incidental. It is contextual evidence that the rituals described in Deuteronomy and Joshua were real practices carried out at real locations. Fifth, the inscription carries enormous implications for the development of writing in Israel. Proto-alphabetic script appearing this early suggests that the Israelites inherited or adapted writing traditions much older than previously assumed. It also implies cultural continuity between the Semitic miners at Sarabat el-Qadim, who left similar script, and the Israelite population entering Canaan. This challenges the narrative that Israel emerged out of Canaanite culture late and gradually. Instead, it points to an early mobile population carrying a recognizable writing system. Finally, the tablet forces the academic world to confront an uncomfortable truth. If this artifact is genuine and the scans leave little doubt, then many theories constructed over the last century need revision. The conquest was earlier than thought. Israel was literate earlier than thought. Worship of YHW began earlier than thought. And the altar on Mount Ebal is not a mysterious cultic installation, but the very structure the biblical text describes. Yet despite all this, the discovery did not become global news. Instead, it entered a fog of hesitation, controversy, and political sensitivity because acknowledging it would require rethinking the foundations of biblical archaeology. And that brings us to the question no one wants to answer openly. Why has such a monumental discovery been met with silence? From the moment the cursed tablet's contents became known, it entered a landscape far more treacherous than archaeology alone, a landscape of politics, territorial disputes, academic rivalry, and deep ideological fault lines. Mount Ebal is not a quiet hill tucked away in an open desert. It sits in one of the most politically sensitive regions on Earth, where excavating a rock can spark international arguments. And in this environment, a tiny lid tablet bearing the ancient name of God became not merely an artifact, but a threat. The first obstacle was location. Mount Ebal lies in the West Bank, a region controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but surrounded by layers of Israeli military oversight. The site of the altar itself is in an area where archaeological work is heavily regulated, often restricted, and always politically charged. Any discovery there risks becoming entangled in debates over land rights, heritage claims, and national narratives. For some, acknowledging a significant Israelite structure on Mount Ebal could be seen as politically explosive. For others, ignoring it might be equally problematic. In such a context, silence became the safest choice. Then there was the academic controversy. Biblical archaeology is one of the most scrutinized fields in the world, and scholars often tread carefully to avoid being associated with anything that appears apologetic or faith-driven. The cursed tablet, with its unmistakable theological content, was immediately viewed with suspicion by many. If the earliest known form of the divine name, YHW, truly dates to the Late Bronze Age, then several long-held academic theories crumble, especially those claiming Israel lacked writing, religion, or national identity in the time of Joshua. Such implications were simply too disruptive. Several universities quietly distanced themselves from the findings. Peer-reviewed journals declined submissions, citing insufficient context or concerns over dating methods. Critics attacked the researchers personally, dismissing them as sensationalists, even though the scans were produced using industrial-grade microtomography far beyond typical archaeological imaging. The problem was not the evidence. The problem was what the evidence implied. Meanwhile, the artifact itself became a point of contention. The tablet was not excavated through a traditional dig, but found in debris removed decades earlier. Though the debris undeniably came from the altar's Adam Zertel, opponents seized on this to undermine the discovery. They argued about context, methodology, authorship, anything to avoid confronting the text inside the lid shrine. And because the tablet was folded shut, they claimed it could not be dated conclusively, even though the dirt layer and associated pottery matched the late Bronze Iron Age transition. Layered over all this was the political sensitivity of the site. After news of the inscription leaked, access to the altar area became even more restricted. Requests for further excavations stalled. Permissions that had once been granted suddenly evaporated. Some suspected that authorities feared renewed archaeological interest could inflame regional tensions. Others believed that academic institutions simply did not want this discovery to overshadow prevailing theories of Israel's early history. The most telling sign of suppression was not aggressive denial, it was avoidance. No major archaeological institution publicly refuted the micro-CT scans. None offered an alternative reading of the inscription. None produced counterdata. Instead, the topic simply vanished from mainstream discourse, as though an agreement had been reached to let the tablet fade quietly into obscurity. But discoveries like this do not disappear. The scans exist. The letters exist. The repeated invocation of YHW exists. And each year, new teams and technologies chip away at the silence. Independent researchers continue to analyze the data. Linguists revisit proto-alphabetic inscriptions. And interest in the altar on Mount Ebal, once a dusty footnote, continues to rise. The question remains, why would a small artifact provoke such discomfort? To answer that, we must understand what the cursed tablet truly reveals. Not just about the past, but about the foundations of biblical history itself. For most people, archaeology is a slow discipline, patient, methodical, cautious. It rarely produces moments that force a fundamental rethinking of early history. Yet every so often, a discovery emerges that refuses to fit the existing narrative, a discovery so small yet so significant that it demands attention. The cursed tablet from Mount Ebal is one of those moments. Not because it proves every detail of the biblical story, but because it reopens debates many scholars believed were already settled. The tablet is, above all, a witness. A witness from a world more ancient than most civilizations we study today. A witness that speaks literally in a script predating the earliest alphabetic inscriptions known from Israel. A witness that carries the earliest form of the divine name, carved into lead by a hand that lived in the age of Joshua. It is an artifact that whispers across millennia. Israel was here. Israel could write. Israel invoked the name of their God earlier than anyone expected. And that alone is transformative. For decades, a foundational assumption in mainstream scholarship held that Israel did not possess a functional alphabet during the period described in the books of Joshua and Judges. If they could not write, the reasoning went, then the biblical narratives must have been composed centuries later, long after the events they describe. The entire early history of Israel was framed through this assumption. The Ebal tablet shatters it. Because if Israelites were indeed literate at this early stage, then the possibility emerges not as dogma, but as historical logic that they could record laws, covenants, stories, victories, and losses. They could preserve memory, not merely through oral tradition but through text. The timeline shifts. The conversation changes, and then there is the matter of geography. The fact that the tablet was found specifically at Mount Ebal, not in a random settlement, not in a later shrine, but at the very mountain associated with curses, covenant, and consecration, forces us to reconsider the accuracy of the biblical account. The presence of a curse tablet exactly where the Bible describes curses being proclaimed is not a trivial coincidence. It suggests a cultural memory both precise and intentional. But the implications do not end there. The altar beneath which the tablet was found is itself a puzzle, built of uncut stones filled with sacrificial remains, oriented toward the valley where blessings and curses were shouted. Its architecture mirrors the biblical commands word for word. For years, scholars debated whether the altar could truly be the one described in the book of Joshua. The tablet's presence strengthens that possibility in a way previous arguments could not. And yet, despite the magnitude of this discovery, silence continues to surround it. Partly due to politics, partly due to academic caution, partly due to the discomfort of reconsidering entrenched assumptions. But artifacts do not bend to ideology. They persist. They speak when we least expect them to. What this means for us is both simple and profound. It means that the ancient world is still capable of surprising us. That stories dismissed as legend may contain kernels of historical truth. That early Israel may have been far more organized, literate, and culturally distinct than previously believed. And that the boundary between faith and archaeology is more porous than many imagine. Most of all, the Ebal tablet invites humility. It reminds us that we do not possess the full story of the past. That our reconstructions, however sophisticated, remain incomplete. That a single object small enough to fit in a child's hand can overturn decades of scholarly certainty. And perhaps that is the most important message of all. If such a discovery can remain buried in the soil for 3 millennia, waiting for the right technology and the right moment to be understood, then what else lies hidden beneath the hills of the biblical world? What inscriptions sleep beneath ancient ruins? What artifacts remain sealed under layers of earth and time? The mountain of Ebal has given us one message. There may be many more,